Hello. Welcome to Dream Me On. My name is Andrew. Tonight, as you move toward the edge of sleep, I'll be here with you. There's no rush here. There's nothing you need to do. You don't have to follow every word. You can simply listen or allow the words to spread around you like a candle burning in a dimly lit room. Now, notice where your body is resting. Let your weight go. Feel the surface beneath you, quietly, effortlessly, holding you. Bring your attention to your breath. Slowly breathe in through your nose. And as you breathe out, allow the tension you've been holding to soften a little more. You're not listening to this story to stay awake. If sleep finds you along the way, that's exactly how it's meant to be. Tonight, I'll take you to a street, slightly removed from the world, to a small cottage that appears when it's needed. Inside, there is warmth, there are memories, and even in the dark, a small light to guide the way. This is the Candlemaker's Cottage on Willow Lane, a story where a light doesn't fade when it's shared, but grows instead, a reminder that sometimes a single flame is enough. When you're ready, you may gently close your eyes, and as the story begins to glow, quietly, like a candle being lit, you can allow yourself to drift slowly, peacefully, towards sleep. Nobody knew exactly when the cottage first appeared. Some said it had always been there, tucked at the very end of Willow Lane where the cobblestones turned to moss and the streetlights flickered like tired fireflies. Others swore it materialized one autumn evening when the fog rolled in thick and silver from the hills. But everyone agreed on one thing. When you needed it most, you would find it. The cottage itself was small, barely larger than a garden shed, with ivy climbing its stone walls and a chimney that released thin ribbons of sweet-smelling smoke into the dusk. A wooden sign hung above the door, so weathered the letters had nearly faded, Brennan's Candles. Inside, the air was golden. Hundreds of candles lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Tall pillars and squat votives. Tapers thin as pencils and jar candles that glowed like captured sunsets. The wax came in every shade imaginable. Cream and amber, sage green and dusty rose, midnight blue and soft lavender. But it wasn't the sight of the candles that drew people in. It was the scent. Each candle carried a memory trapped in wax and wick. Vanilla that smelled exactly like a grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. Pine that brought back Christmas trees from childhood. Lavender that whispered of summer afternoons when time moved slowly and worries seemed impossibly far away. The fragrances shifted and swirled through the small space, never overwhelming, always comforting, like coming home to a place you'd forgotten you'd been missing. At the center of this gentle chaos stood Brennan himself. He was older than the hills, people said, though no one could quite agree on his age. His hair was silver white and wild, escaping from beneath a knitted cap, no matter the season. His hands were steady despite their age, stained with wax and oil, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had done the same careful work for longer than anyone could remember. His eyes were kind, the sort of kind that saw straight through pretense and worry to the tender, tired heart beneath. Brennan never advertised. He didn't need to. The cottage found its visitors, not the other way around. On a Tuesday evening in late October, when the rain had been falling steadily for 3 days and showed no sign of stopping. A woman named Sarah turned down Willow Lane without quite knowing why. She had been walking for hours, her umbrella doing little against the sideways sheets of rain that soaked through her coat and turned her shoes to sodden leather. Her apartment, small, silent, suffocating, had felt impossible to stay in. So she had walked, block after block through the gray evening, past closed shops and curtained windows, past the warm glow of restaurants where people laughed over wine and the blue flicker of televisions in living rooms where families gathered. She walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling the full weight of the year that had crushed her slowly, methodically, like a vice tightening one turn at a time. The job she'd lost in March, the relationship that had ended in June, her father's diagnosis in August, the silence of her phone that used to ring constantly and now sat dark and quiet in her pocket like a stone. Sarah didn't notice when the street changed beneath her feet, when the asphalt gave way to cobblestones worn smooth by a century of footsteps. She didn't see the willow trees that lined this particular lane, their branches hanging low like curtains of green beads, dripping with rain. She simply walked, head down, thoughts spiraling, until she looked up and found herself standing before a cottage she had never seen before. Light glowed through its windows, warm, amber, inviting. Without understanding why, Sarah pushed open the door. The scent hit her first. Vanilla and cinnamon, wood smoke and honey, rain on fresh earth, and something else. Something she couldn't quite name but recognized somewhere deep in her chest. The tightness that had been living beneath her ribs for months loosened, just slightly, just enough to draw a full breath. "Come in, come in," a voice called from somewhere among the shelves. "You're soaked through, aren't you?" Sarah stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Water pooled at her feet on the worn wooden floor. She opened her mouth to apologize, but the man who emerged from between the candle-lined shelves waved her words away with a gentle smile. "The floor has seen worse," Brennan said. He moved with surprising grace for someone his age, crossing to a small pot-bellied stove in the corner where a kettle was already beginning to sing. "Tea first, I think. Then we'll find what you came for." "I didn't come for anything," Sarah said, her voice rough from disuse. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "I was just walking. I didn't even know this place existed." Brennan hummed, pouring steaming water over tea leaves in a chipped ceramic pot. "That's usually how it works." He handed her a cup. No saucer, just a simple mug warm against her cold palms, and gestured to a worn armchair near the stove. Sarah sat, not because she had decided to, but because her legs had decided for her. The chair was exactly the right combination of soft and supportive, the cushions molding to her tired body like they had been waiting for her specifically. Imagine being so exhausted that sitting in a stranger's chair in a shop you'd never heard of felt like the most natural thing in the world. That was where Sarah found herself. "Now then," Brennan said, settling into his own chair across from her with a cup of tea cradled in his weathered hands. "Tell me about the scent you're looking for." "I'm not looking for anything," Sarah repeated, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She was looking for something. She just didn't know what. "Everyone who comes here is looking," Brennan said softly. "Not always for a candle, mind you. Sometimes for a moment of peace. Sometimes for a memory they thought they'd lost. sometimes for proof that somewhere in the world, there's still a bit of warmth left. Sarah stared into her tea. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying scents that shifted with each breath. Bergamot, then chamomile, then something floral she couldn't name. "I don't know what I'm looking for," she admitted, and saying it out loud made her throat tight. "That's all right," Brennan said. "The candles know." He stood then, moving through a shop with the confidence of someone navigating a space they knew better than their own heartbeat. His fingers trailed along shelves, hovering over certain candles, passing others by. Sarah watched, her tea warming her from the inside out, as the old candlemaker seemed to have a silent conversation with his creations. Finally, he selected 3 candles and brought them back to where she sat. The first was small, barely larger than a votive, in a jar of pale blue glass. "This one," Brennan said, holding it up to catch the light, "smells like morning after a storm. Clean air, fresh earth, the feeling of starting over when you thought everything was ruined." He set it on the small table beside her chair and picked up the second candle, taller, in a simple cream-colored container. "This one is memory," he said. "Not a specific memory, mind you. Just the feeling of remembering good things. Sunday mornings. Laughter. The way sunlight looks coming through kitchen windows. It smells different to everyone who burns it, but it always smells like home." The third candle was the largest, a deep amber color in a wide jar. Brennan held this one a moment longer before setting it down. "And this one," he said quietly, "is courage. It doesn't smell like bravery or strength. It smells like the moment right before you do something terrifying, like standing at the edge of something unknown and choosing to step forward anyway. Wood smoke and rain and something sharp underneath, like mint but not quite." Sarah looked at the 3 candles sitting before her. She hadn't asked for them, hadn't told this strange old man anything about her life, her losses, her fears. And yet somehow he had known. "How much?" she asked, reaching for her wallet. Brennan shook his head. "Take them. Burn them when you need them. If they help, come back and tell me about it. If they don't," he shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "well, at least you'll have had some nice-smelling candles." "I can't just take them," Sarah protested. "You can and you will," Brennan said firmly, but not unkindly. "That's how it works here. I make the candles. The candles find the people who need them. Those people take them home. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't. Either way, the candles have done their job." He began wrapping the 3 jars in brown paper, his movements careful and practiced. As he worked, he spoke, not to Sarah directly, but to the room, to the candles, to the rain still pattering against the windows. "I've been making candles for a very long time," he said. "Long enough to know that scent is memory, and memory is hope, and hope is what keeps people going when everything else has fallen apart. Long enough to know that sometimes people don't need solutions. They need reminders. Reminders that good things existed once and could exist again. That storms end. That morning comes. That even in the darkest moments, there's still a bit of light left. Even if it's just a small flame in a jar of wax." He tied the package with twine and handed it to Sarah. She took it, feeling the weight of it in her hands, heavier than 3 candles should be, but not uncomfortably so. It felt substantial, real, like proof of something she couldn't quite articulate. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised to find her eyes burning with tears she hadn't cried in months. "Come back when you're ready," Brennan said, walking her to the door. "Or don't. Either way, you know where to find me now." Sarah stepped back out into the rain, the package tucked under her coat to keep it dry. She turned to look back at the cottage one more time, memorizing its place at the end of Willow Lane, beneath the dripping willow trees, with its warm windows and weathered sign. But even as she watched, the fog rolled in thicker, and by the time she blinked, she wasn't quite sure exactly which cottage had been Brennan's and which were just ordinary homes along an ordinary lane. It didn't matter, she told herself. She knew how to find it now, and something told her that when she needed to return, the cottage would be exactly where she needed it to be. That night, alone in her apartment with the rain still falling outside, Sarah unwrapped the candles and set them on her kitchen table. She started with the smallest one, the pale blue jar. Morning after a storm, the match hissed to life, and she touched it to the wick. The flame caught, flickered, steadied, and then the scent began to bloom into the room. It smelled exactly as Brennan had said, like clean air and fresh earth, like the world washed new. But underneath that, Sarah caught something else, something green and growing, something that whispered not of endings, but of beginnings. She sat at her kitchen table as the candle burned, watching the flame dance and flicker, breathing in that impossible scent. And for the first time in months, she felt something that wasn't quite hope. Not yet, but maybe the distant cousin of hope. The possibility of hope. The idea that someday, possibly, eventually, things might hurt a little less and feel a little lighter. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and something she was learning was enough. But what Sarah didn't know, what none of Brennan's visitors knew, was where the candles truly came from. Late at night, after the last visitor had gone and the cottage was quiet except for the settling of old wood and the whisper of flame, Brennan would descend the narrow stairs to his workshop beneath the shop. The basement was larger than the cottage above, stretching out in directions that didn't quite make geometric sense. Long wooden tables held blocks of wax in every color, waiting to be melted and poured. Shelves lined with bottles of oils and extracts, dried flowers and herbs, things collected from the world above. A piece of driftwood from a beach at dawn, soil from a garden where children had played, ash from a fireplace where a family had gathered on Christmas Eve. Brennan collected memories the way some people collected stamps or coins. He walked through the world, and he walked far more than anyone knew, gathering moments. Not the grand, sweeping moments that made it into history books or photo albums, but the small, quiet ones that people forgot to notice while they were happening. The way morning light slanted through bedroom curtains. The specific weight of a grandmother's hand on a child's shoulder. The sound of rain on a tin roof. The feeling of grass beneath bare feet on the first warm day of spring. These were the things he brought back to his workshop, carefully preserved in bottles and jars, dried and pressed, and stored away for when they would be needed most. When Brennan made a candle, he was not simply mixing wax and scent. He was crafting comfort from captured moments, building hope from borrowed memories, creating something that would remind someone, anyone, that beauty had existed and could exist again. It was exhausting work. Each candle took something from him, a tiny piece of his own warmth, his own light. But Brennan had been doing this work for so long that he couldn't remember what it felt like not to do it. And besides, he reasoned, what good was a light that wasn't shared? Tonight, he worked on 3 new candles to replace the ones Sarah had taken. The first would smell like a library in winter, old paper and wood smoke, the particular quiet that comes from being surrounded by stories. The second would carry the scent of baking bread, yeast and flour, and the golden warmth of ovens. The third would be more complex, sea salt and sage, the sharp, clean smell of wind off the ocean, the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown and beautiful. His hands moved with practiced precision, measuring and melting, mixing and pouring. The wax went into jars he had collected over decades, some new, some antique, each one exactly right for the candle it would hold. As he worked, Brennan hummed to himself, an old tune, older than he was, though that was saying something. The melody wound through the workshop, mingling with the scents, becoming part of the candles themselves. By the time dawn broke pale and gray through the narrow basement windows, 3 new candles sat cooling on his workbench, ready to be carried upstairs, ready to find whoever would need them next. Brennan climbed the stairs slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, though to be fair, nothing was, and set the new candles on their designated shelves. He made himself a cup of tea from the ever-present kettle on the stove and settled into his chair to watch the morning light creep across the shop floor. He would rest a day, maybe close the shop entirely, though that rarely mattered. The cottage had a way of being closed when it needed to be and open when someone needed to find it. But even as he thought this, the door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool autumn air and a young man with shadows under his eyes and grief written in every line of his body. Brennan stood, setting aside his tea. "Come in," he said gently. "You're just in time." The young man's name was Marcus, and he had been driving for 6 hours. He had left the city at dawn, before traffic could clog the highways, before his phone could ring with calls he didn't want to answer, before the weight of his empty apartment could crush him entirely. He had driven with no destination in mind, taking exits at random, following roads that looked interesting or quiet or away from everything he was trying to escape. His brother had died 3 weeks ago, suddenly, senselessly. A car accident on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when tragedy felt impossible and therefore even more cruel when it arrived anyway. Marcus had organized the funeral, cleaned out the apartment, fielded calls from friends and relatives who wanted to share their grief, as if it were something that could be divided up and distributed fairly. He had done everything that needed to be done, moving through the tasks like a machine, functioning because stopping meant breaking, and he couldn't afford a break. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But this morning, he had woken up to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window, and the first thought he'd had was, I should call Jake and tell him about that dream I had. And then he had remembered that Jake was gone, and there was no one to call, and the weight of that realization had sent him out the door and into his car before conscious thought had even caught up with his body. Now he found himself in a town he didn't recognize, on a street that seemed to exist outside of normal geography, standing in a shop that smelled like every good memory he'd ever had all mixed together. "I don't know why I'm here," Marcus said, because it seemed important to be honest in this strange golden space. "That's all right," the old man, Brennan, his name tag read, said. "Sit. I'll make tea." And Marcus, who hadn't sat down for more than 5 minutes at a time in 3 weeks, sat. The chair held him like a hug. The tea, when it came, tasted like comfort he didn't deserve. And the old Candlemaker, with his kind eyes and gentle hands, seemed to understand without being told that Marcus was holding himself together with nothing but will and the terror of what would happen if he let go. "You've lost someone," Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "Recently." Another nod. "And you haven't let yourself grieve yet, because grief feels too big and too dangerous and too much." Marcus looked up sharply. "How did you?" "I'm old," Brennan said with a small smile. "I've seen every kind of sorrow there is. Yours is the kind that thinks if it stays still and quiet enough, maybe it can keep everything from falling apart. The kind that's terrified that once it starts crying, it might never stop." Marcus felt something crack in his chest. "I can't," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "If I start, I won't. I can't." "I know," Brennan said softly, "but you also can't keep carrying it like this. Grief isn't something you can organize or file away or schedule for a more convenient time. It's a flood that will find its way out whether you open the gates or not. The only choice you have is whether it flows out gently or explodes all at once." He stood and moved through his shelves again, this time selecting candles with even more care than usual. The first was a deep forest green in a jar that looked hand-blown, slightly uneven, but beautiful because of it. "This one smells like rain in the woods," Brennan said. "The kind of rain that makes you feel small, but not insignificant, connected to something larger than yourself." The second was pale gold, almost translucent. "This one is memory, but not the painful kind. This is the kind of memory that makes you smile even while you're crying." Sunday mornings. Inside jokes. The way someone laughed. The good parts, preserved like honey. The third candle was unusual. The wax was layered in shades of blue and gray, like storm clouds. "And this one," Brennan said, holding it carefully, "is permission. Permission to fall apart. Permission to not be okay. Permission to grieve in whatever messy, broken, non-linear way it needs to happen. It smells like ocean air, salt and wind and vastness. It smells like letting go." He wrapped the 3 candles in brown paper, tying the package with the same careful attention he gave all his work. "Take them home," Brennan said. "Burn them when you're ready. Or don't burn them at all. Sometimes just knowing they're there is enough." "But Marcus..." He waited until the young man looked up and met his eyes. "Let yourself break. Breaking is how the light gets in." Marcus took the package with shaking hands. He wanted to say thank you, wanted to ask how much he owed, wanted to understand what this place was and why it felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for too long. But all he managed was, "How did you know my name?" Brennan smiled. "You told me, didn't you, when you came in?" Marcus didn't remember doing that. But then again, he didn't remember a lot of things these days. Memory had become slippery, unreliable, full of holes where his brother used to be. "Come back if you need to," Brennan said, opening the door for him. "The cottage will be here." Marcus stepped out into the cool morning air. He looked back once, trying to memorize the location, but the street signs had that peculiar quality of being both perfectly clear and strangely hard to focus on. It didn't matter. Somehow, he knew he could find it again if he needed to. Over the following weeks, Brennan's cottage received its usual stream of visitors. A woman named Jennifer arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, her U-Haul still packed with boxes, having just moved across the country for a job she wasn't sure she wanted. She had left behind her best friend of 20 years, her nephew who she'd helped raise, her favorite coffee shop where the barista knew her order by heart. Everything familiar, everything safe, all of it abandoned for a promotion that felt more like running away than moving forward. She found the cottage while searching for a grocery store, turned down a street that wasn't on her GPS, and suddenly there it was, glowing warmly in the gray afternoon, looking exactly like refuge feels. Brennan made her tea with extra honey, somehow knowing she needed the sweetness, and listened as she explained that she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice, that she was terrified of starting over, that she missed her old life so intensely it felt like grief. Endings and beginnings are the same thing from different angles, Brennan said quietly, selecting candles with careful attention. You can't have one without the other. The trick is learning to honor what you've left behind while still moving toward what's ahead. He gave her 4 candles. One that smelled like home. Whatever home meant to her, he said it would smell right. One that smelled like courage. Not bravery in the face of danger, but the quiet strength it takes to keep going when you're not sure where you're going. One that smelled like new beginnings, fresh paint and morning air and possibility. And one, smaller than the others, that smelled like memory, for the nights when she needed to remember that good things had existed and would exist again. Jennifer left with tears in her eyes and candles clutched to her chest, feeling seen in a way that made her braver than she'd felt in months. 2 days later, a teenage boy named Alex found the cottage after practice. He was 16, drowning under the weight of expectations from every direction. His parents wanted him to focus on academics, get into an Ivy League school, become a doctor like his father. His coach wanted him to commit to basketball, accept the scholarship offers already coming in, go pro if he could. His friends wanted him to be fun, spontaneous, always available for whatever they had planned. And Alex? Alex wanted to be an artist, wanted to spend his days painting and drawing, creating beauty for its own sake, making things that mattered to him even if they didn't matter to anyone else. But art wasn't practical. Art didn't come with scholarships or guaranteed income or parental approval. Art was the thing he did in secret, late at night, when everyone else was asleep and couldn't ask him why he was wasting his time. He slumped into Brennan's chair with the exhausted heaviness of someone carrying too much for too long. I don't even know who I am anymore, Alex said into his teacup. I'm whoever everyone else needs me to be, and I don't know if there's anything left underneath all that. Brennan nodded slowly, his weathered hands wrapped around his own cup. Identity is a difficult thing, he said, especially when everyone around you has decided who you should be before you figure out who you are. But here's the truth. You are whoever you are in your secret moments. The version of yourself that exists when no one is watching. That's the real you. Everything else is costume. He selected candles that smelled like freedom, wide open spaces and wind, and the particular lightness that comes from choosing yourself, even when it's hard. Candles that smelled like creativity, paint and paper, and the electric feeling of making something from nothing. Candles that smelled like truth, sharp and clean and uncomfortable but necessary. You don't have to decide everything right now, Brennan said as he wrapped the candles. But you do have to start listening to the part of yourself that knows what you need, even if it's not what everyone else wants for you. Alex left the cottage with something that felt dangerously close to hope, and for the first time in months, went home and pulled out his sketchbook without waiting for darkness to give him permission. An elderly man named Robert came to the cottage on a Sunday evening when the rain was falling soft and steady, the kind of rain that feels like the world itself is grieving. His wife Eleanor had died 6 months ago after 53 years of marriage. The house they'd shared still smelled like her favorite perfume. He kept a bottle on the bathroom counter, opening it sometimes just to breathe in something that reminded him she had been real, had existed, had loved him. Her clothes still hung in the closet because he couldn't bear to pack them away. Her glasses still sat on the nightstand. Her coffee mug, the one with the faded flowers that she'd used every single morning for 20 years, still sat in the kitchen cabinet, and Robert couldn't bring himself to drink from it or give it away. He wandered into the cottage without quite knowing how he'd gotten there, his feet carrying him while his mind was elsewhere, lost in memory and absence. Brennan took one look at him and knew. Grief has a particular shape to it, a weight that's visible in how people hold themselves, in the careful way they move through the world, as if afraid of disturbing the memories. "Sit," Brennan said gently. "I'll make tea." Robert sat, accepted the tea, and then, without meaning to, he started talking. About Eleanor, about their first date, a terrible movie they'd both hated but stayed through anyway because neither wanted the evening to end. About their wedding day, when it had rained just like this and Eleanor had laughed, saying it was good luck, saying she didn't care about the weather as long as she got to marry him. About raising 3 children who were now grown and scattered across the country, busy with their own lives, checking in regularly, but unable to fill the particular Eleanor-shaped hole in his daily existence. "I talked to her," Robert said quietly, staring into his tea. "Every morning with my coffee. Every evening when I get home. I tell her about my day like she's still there. The neighbors probably think I've lost my mind." "You haven't lost anything," Brennan said firmly. "Accept her. And that's not the same as losing your mind. That's just love continuing in the only way it can when the person is gone. There's nothing wrong with that." He selected candles carefully, more carefully than usual, with the particular attention of someone who understood that grief required delicate handling. The first candle smelled like Eleanor, though Brennan had never met her. It smelled like vanilla and lavender, like the perfume Robert kept on the bathroom counter, like the essence of 53 years of love condensed in a waxen wick. The second smelled like memory, but not the painful kind. This was the kind of memory that made you smile even while crying. Sunday mornings, reading the paper together. Inside jokes no one else would ever understand. The particular way she laughed at his terrible puns. The third smelled like continuance, like the understanding that love doesn't end when a person dies, it just changes form. It smelled like morning coffee and quiet evenings and the steady, enduring presence of someone who had been loved deeply and well. "You're allowed to keep talking to her," Brennan said as he wrapped the candles. "You're allowed to keep her coffee mug. You're allowed to take as long as you need to figure out how to live in a world where she's no longer physically present. There's no timeline for this. There's no right way to grieve someone you love that much." Robert left the cottage with the candles held carefully, reverently, like he was carrying something precious. Which in a way he was. A young woman named Lisa found the cottage on a Thursday morning when she should have been at work but couldn't bring herself to go. She had been experiencing anxiety attacks for months, sudden, overwhelming moments when her heart raced and her hands shook and the world felt too big and too loud and impossibly threatening. She'd started avoiding things. First crowded places, then any social situations, then eventually leaving her apartment at all. She'd called in sick to work again, the third time this week, and her boss had been understanding but firm. Get help or we'll have to let you go. But getting help meant admitting something was wrong, meant facing the possibility that this wasn't something she could just push through or ignore into submission. It meant being vulnerable in a way that felt terrifying. She'd been walking because walking was still safe as long as she stayed close to home, when she'd stumbled onto Willow Lane quite by accident. Or perhaps not by accident at all. Brennan greeted her at the door, took one look at the tight way she was holding her shoulders, the rapid, shallow breathing, the fear in her eyes, and immediately understood. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Not come in or can I help you, but simply you're safe here. Because sometimes that's the only thing that matters." Lisa burst into tears, the ugly, gasping kind of crying that comes from holding everything in for too long. Brennan didn't try to stop her or comfort her or tell her it would be okay. He just let her cry, handed her a box of tissues, and waited patiently until the storm passed. "I can't keep living like this," Lisa said finally, her voice raw. "I'm so tired of being afraid. I'm so tired of feeling broken. I just want to be normal again." "You're not broken," Brennan said firmly. "Your nervous system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting you from perceived threats. The problem is that it's gotten confused about what's actually dangerous and what isn't. But that can be fixed, slowly, carefully, with professional help and patience and compassion for yourself." He selected candles that smelled like safety, warm bread and honey, the scent of home and comfort and protection. Candles that smelled like grounding, earth and rain and solid, real things that anchored you to the present moment. Candles that smelled like calm, lavender and chamomile, the olfactory equivalent of a hand on your shoulder saying, "Breathe, just breathe, you're okay." "These won't fix the anxiety," Brennan said as he wrapped them. "Nothing will fix it overnight. It's not that kind of problem. But they might help, might give you moments of peace in the chaos, might remind your nervous system what safety actually feels like so it can start to recalibrate." He also wrote down the name of a therapist, someone who specialized in anxiety, someone patient and kind, someone who understood that healing wasn't linear and setbacks weren't failures. "Promise me you'll call," Brennan said, handing her the paper along with the candles. "The candles will help, but you need more than candles. You need someone who can teach you how to work with your anxiety instead of against it." Lisa promised, meaning it for the first time in months. There was something about this strange old man and his impossible kindness that made her believe that maybe, possibly, she could get better. That normal might not be achievable or even desirable, but that okay, actually okay, genuinely okay, might be closer than she thought. Each visitor found the cottage at exactly the moment they needed it most. Each one left with candles wrapped in brown paper, carrying scents that would help them remember that even in darkness, even in grief, even in change and loss and fear, there were still moments worth holding on to, still reasons to keep going. Brennan never rushed anyone, never insisted they buy anything, never asked for more than they could give. Some people paid with money. Others paid with stories, telling him about the person they'd lost, the life they'd left behind, the dream they were chasing or running from. He listened to all of it with the same patient kindness, making tea, offering chairs, letting his shop be a refuge from a world that so rarely offered places to rest. Between visitors, Brennan would sit in his chair and simply breathe, gathering his strength for the next person who would need him. The work was exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Each visitor left a piece of their pain in his shop, and Brennan absorbed it all, transformed it, alchemized it into something that could be held in wax and carried home as comfort. It was necessary work, important work, but it was also slowly, inevitably draining him. But there was something most visitors didn't know, something Brennan carried quietly and alone. Making candles was only half his work. The other half happened in dreams. Each night, after the cottage was dark and the street outside had gone silent, Brennan would sit in a chair by the dying fire and let himself drift into a space that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. In this space, he could see them, all the people who had taken his candles home. He couldn't control what he saw, couldn't direct his attention like turning channels on a television, but he could witness, could watch as Sarah lit her morning after the storm candle and sat at her kitchen table, breathing in the scent of new beginnings. Could see Marcus finally let himself cry as he burned the permission candle, his sobs shaking his entire body while the scent of ocean air filled his apartment. He saw the woman who had moved across country light her memory candle and call her mother for the first time in weeks, the scent helping her remember that distance didn't have to mean disconnection. He saw the teenager burn his courage candle before a difficult conversation with his parents, the wood smoke and mint smell giving him just enough strength to say, "I'm not sure this is what I want," and mean it. He saw the elderly man who had lost his wife light all three of his candles at once, against all instructions, and sit in the combined glow, whispering to empty air about his day, his memories, his loneliness, his love. Brennan witnessed all of it from his chair by the fire, his own candles burning low around him, and felt the weight of it settle into his bones. This was the price of the work he did. Not exhaustion, exactly, though there was that too, but the accumulated tenderness of watching people hurt and heal, break and mend, over and over again. Some nights it felt like too much. Some nights he wondered if perhaps he had been making candles for too long, had given away too many pieces of his own light. But then someone new would stumble through his door, lost, hurting, desperate for comfort they didn't know how to name, and Brennan would remember why he started this work in the first place. Because everyone deserves a refuge. Everyone deserves a moment of warmth in the cold. Everyone deserves to be reminded that they are not alone, that their pain is valid, that somewhere in the world, someone took the time to capture beauty in wax and wick just for them. This was Brennan's calling, his purpose, his gift to a world that so often felt short on gentleness. And so he would rise each morning, make his tea, tend his candles, and wait for whoever needed to find him next. 3 months after her first visit, Sarah returned to Willow Lane. It was a Sunday afternoon in January, cold but clear, with sunlight so bright it made the frost on the ground sparkle like scattered diamonds. She had walked this route deliberately this time, no longer lost or desperate, but seeking something she couldn't quite articulate. The cottage was exactly where she remembered it, and yet she could have sworn the street looked different in daylight. The willow trees were bare now, their branches creating delicate shadows on the cobblestones. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the windows glowed even in the afternoon sun. Sarah knocked before entering, though she wasn't sure why. It felt right somehow. Respectful. Come in, Brennan's voice called, just as it had the first time. She pushed open the door and was immediately enveloped in warmth. The scent was different today, cinnamon and clove, orange peel, and something woody. Winter smells. Comfort smells. Brennan emerged from behind his shelves, and if he was surprised to see her, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled as if he had been expecting her all along. Tea, he offered. Please, Sarah said. They settled into the same chairs as before, the same ritual of ceramic mugs and rising steam. Sarah wrapped her hands around her cup and realized she wasn't sure where to start. The candles helped, she said finally. I'm glad, Brennan replied simply. The first one, the morning after the storm one, I burned it the night I got home. And I don't know how to explain it. It smelled exactly like hope feels. Like maybe things could get better, even if I couldn't see how yet. Brennan nodded, listening. The second one, the memory candle, I saved that for a few weeks. I was afraid of it, I think. Afraid that remembering good things would make the current bad things hurt worse. But when I finally lit it, Sarah paused, her throat tight. It smelled like my dad's garden, the one he had when I was little before we moved, before everything got complicated. And I remembered being 6 years old and helping him plant tomatoes, and how safe I felt, and how simple everything seemed. And the third, Brennan asked gently, the courage candle. Sarah smiled, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I burned that last week, right before I went to a job interview for a position I'm not qualified for but want desperately. The interview went well. I don't know if I'll get it, but I showed up. I tried, and that felt like a beginning. Beginnings are underrated, Brennan said. Everyone focuses on endings, dramatic, final, definitive. But beginnings are quiet, uncertain. They take more courage than endings, I think, because you have to choose them. Endings just happen. Beginnings require hope. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping tea, listening to the fire crackle in the stove. I wanted to pay you, Sarah said, for the candles. I know you said not to, but it doesn't feel right taking them for free. You already paid, Brennan said. You came back. You told me your story. You proved that the candles did what they were meant to do. He stood, moving to his shelves. But since you're here, I think there might be a few more candles calling to you. This time, he selected 4 candles with different care than before. These weren't about survival or getting through crisis. These were about growth, about the slow, uncertain work of building a life rather than just enduring one. The first was a soft pink, almost rose-colored. This one is friendship, Brennan said. For reaching out when you're lonely, even though it's terrifying. It smells like fresh flowers and morning coffee, the kind you share with someone who makes you laugh. The second was sage green, earthy and grounding. This one is patience. For the days when progress feels impossible. When you're doing everything right and nothing seems to change. It smells like gardens and growing things, reminding you that all good things take time. The third was deep purple, rich and mysterious. This one is curiosity. for staying interested in your own life, even when it's hard, for asking what if instead of why me. It smells like books and rain and distant places, like adventure is possible, even in small ways. The fourth candle was unlike any Sarah had seen in a shop before. The wax seemed to shift colors in the light, gold, then amber, then something close to bronze. And this one, Brennan said softly, holding it with particular reverence, is joy, not happiness. That's too fragile, too dependent on circumstances. But joy, the deep, defiant kind that shows up even in the middle of hard times. That laughs in the face of difficulty. That insists on noticing beauty even when everything is terrible. It smells different to everyone, but it always smells like life worth living. He wrapped the 4 candles carefully, his weathered hands moving with the same practiced grace. "How much?" Sarah asked, pulling out her wallet. "How much do you think they're worth?" Brennan replied. Sarah thought about it, about what these candles represented, about the light they would bring to dark rooms and darker moments, about the comfort they provided that couldn't be quantified or priced. "More than I can afford," she said honestly. Brennan smiled. "Then pay what you can, or pay nothing at all, or come back in 6 months and tell me how you're doing. Any of those options work for me." Sarah pulled out 2 20s and set them on the table beside her chair. It was probably too little for 4 hand-poured candles that contained what felt like actual magic. But it was what she had budgeted for groceries this week, and giving it felt right. Felt like an investment in her own future. Felt like choosing hope. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more deeply than those 2 words could possibly convey. "Thank you," Brennan replied, "for trusting the candles, for trusting yourself, for coming back." As Sarah left the cottage, the package of candles held carefully against her chest, she looked back one more time. Brennan stood in the doorway, backlit by the golden glow of 100 burning candles, and raised one hand in farewell. "The cottage will be here," he called after her. And somehow, Sarah knew that was a promise that would hold true no matter how much time passed or how far she wandered. But that same evening, as the sun set and the temperature dropped and the first stars began to appear in the clear winter sky, someone else was searching for Willow Lane. His name was David, and he had heard about the cottage from a friend of a cousin. The way these things always spread, through whispers and suggestions, and people saying there's this place that might help without really explaining what or where or why. David had been searching for 3 hours now, walking the same streets over and over, certain he had the right neighborhood, but unable to find the lane that supposedly existed at the edge of town. He had checked his phone's map a dozen times. He had asked passers-by who looked at him with confused expressions and said they'd lived here for years and never heard of any Willow Lane. He was about to give up, to accept that the cottage was either a myth or not meant for him, when he turned a corner and found himself on a street he could have sworn hadn't been there a moment ago. Cobblestones, willow trees, a row of small houses with warm windows, and at the very end, a cottage with smoke curling from its chimney and a weathered sign above the door. David's hands shook as he approached, not from cold, though it was freezing, from need, from desperation, from the weight of carrying something he couldn't carry alone anymore. He opened the door. The scent hit him like a memory he'd forgotten he had. Vanilla and wood smoke, rain and roses, something sweet and something sharp, all mixed together in a way that shouldn't work, but did. Come in," a voice said. You look frozen through. David stepped inside and saw the old man, ancient, really, with wild white hair and kind eyes, gesturing to a chair by a small stove where a kettle was already beginning to sing. "I don't," David started, then stopped. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the emptiness that had been growing inside him for months. The sense that he was disappearing bit by bit, becoming someone he didn't recognize and didn't particularly like. "Sit," Brennan said gently. "Tea first, then we'll figure out what you came for." And David, who had spent the last year trying to stay strong and keep everything together and never show weakness, sat down in that chair and felt something inside him finally relax. Just a little, just enough. The conversation that followed was quieter than most. David wasn't good with words, never had been, and he struggled to articulate what he was feeling. But Brennan didn't push. He just listened and nodded and occasionally asked a gentle question that helped David find the next piece of what he was trying to say. Slowly, haltingly, the story emerged. A job that paid well, but crushed his soul a little more each day. A relationship that had ended not with drama, but with a slow fading of connection until one day they both realized they were just going through motions. Friends who had scattered to different cities, different lives, leaving behind only occasional text messages that felt more obligatory than genuine. "I'm not sad exactly," David said, staring into his tea. "I'm just empty, like I'm watching my own life happen to someone else. Like I'm here, but not really here. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Brennan said. "You're describing disconnection from yourself, from your life, from any sense of purpose or meaning. It's one of the most common forms of suffering and one of the hardest to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it." David looked up, surprised to be understood so completely. "The good news," Brennan continued, "is that disconnection can be healed. Not quickly, not easily, but it can be one small reconnection at a time. One moment of actually feeling something, anything, instead of just going through the motions." He moved through his shop, selecting candles with the same careful attention he gave every visitor. "This one," he said, holding up a candle the color of sunset, orange and pink and gold all swirled together, "is presence. For learning to be actually here instead of floating somewhere above your own life. It smells like warm bread and honey, simple things that anchor you to the moment." The second candle was deep blue, almost navy. "This one is feeling. Not happy feelings necessarily, just feelings. Permission to be angry or sad or frustrated or confused instead of numb. It smells like thunderstorms, electric and alive and impossible to ignore." The third was cream-colored with flecks of green throughout. "This one is connection. For reaching out even when it feels pointless. For showing up for yourself and others even when you're not sure why. It smells like gardens after rain, like growth happening even when you can't see it." He wrapped the candles in brown paper, tied them with twine, and handed the package to David. "Burn them slowly," Brennan said, "one at a time, and pay attention, not just to how they smell, but to how they make you feel. The candles aren't magic in the way people usually mean that word. They can't fix anything, but they can remind you what it feels like to be alive. And sometimes that's enough to start with." David took the package, feeling its weight in his hands. "How much?" he asked. "Whatever feels right," Brennan replied. "Or nothing. Or come back someday and tell me if they helped. Any of those works. David pulled out his wallet and left $30 on the table. More than he could probably afford, less than what he suspected these candles were worth. "Thank you," he said. Then, because it felt important to be honest in this strange, warm space, he added, "I'm not sure I believe this will help, but I'm grateful that you're trying." Brennan smiled. "Doubt is allowed. Expected even. The candles will work whether you believe in them or not." As David left the cottage and stepped back out into the cold night, he looked back one more time. The light from the windows cast golden rectangles on the cobblestones. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the old candlemaker stood in the doorway, watching him go with an expression that managed to be both knowing and hopeful at the same time. David walked back toward his car, parked somewhere on the edge of this peculiar neighborhood, and found himself unable to remember exactly which streets he'd taken to get here. The route seemed to have shifted in his mind, becoming hazy and uncertain. It didn't matter. He had the candles, and somehow that felt like enough. Winter deepened. January became February. The world outside Brennan's cottage grew colder, snow falling in thick curtains that muffled sound and turned everything white and quiet. Fewer visitors came during these coldest months, but those who did come needed the candles more desperately than usual. There was something about deep winter, the short days, the long nights, the sense of being trapped inside both houses and heads, that brought people to their breaking points. Brennan welcomed them all, made endless cups of tea, listened to stories of loneliness and loss, fear and frustration, dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. He matched each visitor with candles chosen specifically for their particular brand of suffering, their specific shape of need. And late at night, in the space between waking and sleep, he watched them all. Saw Sarah burning her joy candle on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing particularly joyful was happening, letting the scent fill her apartment as a reminder that happiness didn't have to be earned or justified. Saw Marcus finally, slowly, beginning to talk about his brother again, not with the raw grief of early loss, but with the bittersweet ache of treasured memory. Saw David light his presence candle before breakfast one morning and actually taste his food for the first time in months, noticing the sweetness of jam and the warmth of toast like they were revelations. These small victories sustained Brennan through his own exhaustion, because making candles, real candles, the kind that carried comfort and healing and hope, took energy most people couldn't imagine. Each candle required him to reach deep into his own reserves of warmth and light, to give away pieces of himself that were already worn thin from decades of giving. Some mornings, he woke up feeling translucent, barely there, as if he had given away so much of himself that soon there would be nothing left. But then someone would knock on the door, desperate and hurting, and Brennan would pull himself together one more time because this was his work, his calling, his reason for existing. He had been the candlemaker of Willow Lane for longer than anyone knew, longer than he could remember, if he was honest with himself. The world outside had changed dramatically since he first started making candles. Buildings replaced by other buildings, technologies he didn't understand, ways of living that seemed both faster and lonelier than they used to be. But human pain hadn't changed. Neither had human need for comfort, for connection, for small moments of peace in the chaos. That was why Brennan kept making candles. That was why he would keep making them until his hands no longer worked or his light finally, completely ran out. Because as long as people needed comfort, he would provide it. As long as people needed reminding that beauty existed, he would capture it in wax and wick. As long as people needed hope, he would wrap it in brown paper and send it home with them into the darkness. In March, when the snow finally began to melt and the first brave crocuses pushed through the frozen ground, Sarah got the job she'd interviewed for. She called her mother to share the news. And for the first time in years, the conversation didn't end in argument or awkward silence. They talked for an hour about nothing important. The weather, a recipe her mother had tried, a show they'd both been watching. Simple things. Connection without weight. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her apartment with her joy candle burning nearby and realized something startling. She was happy. Not the fragile, circumstantial happiness that depended on everything going right, but the deeper kind, the kind that existed underneath worry and stress and uncertainty, the kind that whispered, "This is enough, you are enough, life is worth living," even when things weren't perfect. She thought about the candlemaker with his wild white hair and gentle hands, about the cottage at the end of Willow Lane that appeared exactly when people needed it most. She should visit again, she thought. She should thank him, should tell him about the job and the phone call with her mother and the slow, uncertain, miraculous process of building a life she actually wanted to live instead of just enduring. But March was busy with training at the new job, and April brought projects that kept her working late, and May arrived with its own challenges and changes. The weeks accumulated, the months passed, and though Sarah thought about visiting the cottage regularly, she never quite found the time. The candles, though, those she used carefully, reverently, burning each one slowly to make them last. The friendship candle when she finally worked up the courage to text an old college roommate and suggest they meet for coffee. The patience candle during a difficult project at work when everything felt impossible and progress felt microscopic. The curiosity candle when she signed up for a pottery class on a whim, deciding that trying new things was better than staying safe and bored. And always, always the joy candle, that one she burned most frequently, letting its scent fill her space as a reminder that happiness was a choice she could make regardless of circumstances. Marcus, too, found himself thinking often about the cottage and the old candlemaker who had known exactly what he needed before he could articulate himself. The grief hadn't disappeared. He wasn't sure it ever would, but it had changed shape, becoming something he could carry rather than something that crushed him. He had started therapy in February, had begun volunteering at an animal shelter in March, because being around creatures who needed care gave him purpose when his own life felt purposeless. Had even, tentatively, started dating someone in April, though he wasn't sure where it would lead and was trying not to pressure himself to figure it out. The candle sat on his bedside table, mostly used up now, but still precious. He had burned the permission candle so many times it was nearly gone, the wick drowning in the last pooled bits of wax. He should probably throw it away, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. It felt like throwing away a friend, like abandoning something that had held him together when he was falling apart. Instead, he carefully scraped out the remaining wax, saving it in a small jar. Maybe someday he could return to the cottage and asked the candlemaker to add it to a new candle. Maybe that's how these things worked, recycling comfort, passing it forward, turning grief into something that could help someone else survive their own darkness. He tried to find Willow Lane several times, drove through the town where he was sure he'd been, walking streets that looked familiar but never quite right. The cottage remained elusive, hidden, existing somewhere just outside his ability to locate it deliberately. But Marcus held onto the belief that if he needed it desperately enough, he would find it again. And knowing it existed, knowing that somewhere in the world there was a place dedicated entirely to providing comfort to hurting people, was almost as helpful as the candles themselves. David burned through his candles more quickly than he'd intended, using them almost every day during the worst of winter. The presence candle helped him start actually tasting his food again, noticing his surroundings, being aware of his own body instead of just a floating consciousness moving through life on autopilot. The feeling candle was harder. At first, nothing happened. He lit it, smelled the thunderstorm scent, waited for some miraculous return of emotion. But gradually, over weeks of burning it regularly, he noticed small cracks in the numbness. Frustration at traffic, amusement at a joke a coworker told, sadness watching a movie. The feelings weren't dramatic or overwhelming, but they were there. He was alive to them, and that was something. The connection candle he saved for specific occasions. He burned it before calling his sister, whom he hadn't spoken to in months, before meeting a friend for drinks, pushing himself to show up even though canceling felt easier, before his book club meeting where he actually contributed to the discussion instead of just sitting silently in the corner. By late spring, David found himself planning to quit his soul-crushing job. He didn't have another one lined up, which was terrifying, but continuing to waste his life doing work that made him miserable seemed more terrifying than the uncertainty of change. He wanted to tell the candlemaker about this decision, wanted to explain that those 3 candles had been the catalyst for everything, for reconnecting with himself, for choosing to feel instead of go numb, for reaching out to others even when isolation felt easier. But when he tried to find Willow Lane again, the street had seemingly vanished. He spent an entire Saturday driving through the neighborhood, certain he remembered the route, but the cottage remained stubbornly absent. Maybe, he thought, it only appeared when people were at their breaking point, when they needed it most desperately. And since he wasn't broken anymore, not fixed exactly, but no longer broken, maybe the cottage had moved on to help someone else. The thought was both disappointing and comforting. Disappointing because he wanted to express his gratitude. Comforting because it meant someone else, somewhere, was finding the refuge he had found. Spring became summer. The days grew long and warm. Gardens bloomed. People spent their evenings outside, walking through neighborhoods made beautiful by flowers and fading light. Brennan's cottage received fewer visitors during these months. Summer was easier somehow, the sunshine and warmth providing their own kind of comfort, their own therapy. But there were still moments of darkness even in the brightest season. Still people who needed candles that smelled like hope and healing and home. A college student having a crisis of faith about her major, her future, her entire carefully planned life that no longer felt like it fit. An elderly woman whose doctor had just delivered bad news, not urgent but serious. Not a death sentence, but a clear reminder that time was finite and she needed to make choices about how she wanted to spend what remained. A middle-aged man going through a divorce that had somehow blindsided him despite years of growing distance from his wife. A teenage girl struggling with identity, with belonging, with the exhausting work of becoming herself in a world that constantly told her who she should be instead. Brennan met them all with the same patient kindness, the same ritual of tea and listening and carefully selected candles, the same brown paper wrapping in twine, the same gentle sending forth into the world with talismans of comfort held close. And late at night, he watched them in that space between waking and sleep. Watched the college student light her courage candle before changing her major to something she actually loved. Watched the elderly woman burn her presence candle and decide to finally take that trip to Paris she'd been postponing for 40 years. Watched the divorcing man use his healing candle while sorting through boxes of memories, choosing what to keep and what to release. Watched the teenage girl light her identity candle and finally have a conversation with her parents she'd been terrified to have. These small acts of bravery sustained Brennan through his own increasing exhaustion, because he was tired, more tired than he'd ever been in his very long life. Each candle he made took a little more from him than the last. Each visitor he helped left him a little more depleted. He was wearing thin, becoming translucent, giving away so much light that soon, possibly very soon, there would be nothing left. But not yet. Not quite yet. There were still people who needed him. Still hurting souls stumbling toward Willow Lane in their darkest moments. Still candles to make and comfort to provide and hope to package in brown paper with careful hands. So Brennan kept going, kept making candles in his basement workshop, kept tending his shop with its golden light and impossible scents, kept being the refuge for people who had nowhere else to turn. Because this was his purpose, his calling, his gift to a world that desperately needed more gentleness. And he would keep giving until there was nothing left to give. In August, on a Thursday evening when the air was thick with humidity and the promise of thunderstorms, 3 people arrived at Willow Lane within an hour of each other. This was unusual. The cottage typically appeared to one person at a time, giving each visitor the full attention they deserved. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the universe seemed to have decided that these 3 specific people needed to meet each other as much as they needed Brennan's candles. Sarah arrived first, finally making the trip she'd been meaning to make for months. She wanted to thank the Candlemaker, wanted to tell him about the life she was building, wanted to buy more candles, yes, but mostly just wanted to sit in that golden space one more time and feel the peace it provided. Marcus arrived second, having stumbled onto Willow Lane quite by accident while visiting a friend across town. He had turned a corner and suddenly, impossibly, there it was, the cottage he'd been unable to find for months, appearing exactly when he'd stopped looking for it. David arrived third, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He'd been walking, thinking about his upcoming last day at his old job, feeling equal parts terrified and exhilarated about the unknown future ahead, when he found himself on a street that felt familiar in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to bone-deep recognition. They converged on the cottage within minutes of each other. 3 strangers arriving simultaneously at a place that usually appeared to one person at a time. Brennan greeted them at the door with a smile that managed to be both surprised and knowing. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected. Come in, all of you. I'll make tea." The cottage seemed to expand to accommodate 3 visitors, not physically, exactly, but in the way space sometimes does when it needs to hold more than it should be able to. 3 chairs appeared around the small stove. 3 cups of tea materialized, and the 3 strangers found themselves sitting together in comfortable, curious silence. "I'm Sarah," she said finally, because someone needed to break the ice. "Marcus. David." They looked at each other, trying to figure out what they had in common, why they had all ended up here at the same moment. "You've all been here before," Brennan said, settling into his own chair with a cup of tea. It wasn't a question. They nodded. "And you've all been using the candles?" More nods. "Then perhaps," Brennan said thoughtfully, "you ended up here together because you're ready for the next step. The candles helped you survive. Now it's time to learn to help each other thrive." He stood and moved through his shop, this time selecting candles with a different kind of care. Not candles for individual healing, but candles meant to be shared. The first was large, in a wide jar, with wax that swirled in shades of gold and cream. "This one is community," Brennan said, "for remembering that you're not alone, for reaching out and letting others reach back. It smells like bread baking, the kind of smell that makes you want to gather people around a table and share a meal." The second was deep green with flecks of gold throughout. "This one is shared joy, for celebrating other people's victories even when you're still struggling, for understanding that happiness multiplies when it's divided. It smells like champagne and strawberries and summer nights when anything feels possible." The third was unusual, 3 wicks instead of 1, all burning in the same jar. "And this one," Brennan said softly, "is chosen family. For the people you find along the way who become as important as the family you were born into. For the friends who show up when you need them. For the connections that sustain you through the hardest times. It smells different to each person, but it always smells like home." He wrapped 3 sets of these candles, 1 set for each visitor, and handed them out with his usual care. "You found each other here for a reason," he said. "Maybe that reason is simply that you needed to know you're not alone in this. That other people have struggled and survived. That healing is possible, even when it feels impossible. Or maybe," he paused, smiling slightly, "maybe you're meant to be friends, to support each other, to remind each other that light exists even in darkness." The 3 strangers looked at each other again, this time with recognition dawning. They had all been here in this cottage, receiving comfort from this strange old man and his impossible candles. They had all been drowning in different ways. They had all found something here that saved them. Before leaving, they exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet for coffee the following week, promised to keep in touch, to check in, to be there for each other in the way strangers who recognize each other's pain sometimes can be. As they left together, walking down Willow Lane into the warm summer night, Brennan watched from his doorway. He looked more tired than usual, more translucent, as if making those last sets of candles had cost him more than he could easily afford. But he was smiling, because connection was the whole point. Healing was good, survival was necessary, but connection, that was what made life worth living. The rest of summer passed in a blur of heat and humidity, long evenings and brief thunderstorms that cooled things off temporarily before the heat returned. Brennan's cottage appeared less frequently now, not because fewer people needed it, but because Brennan himself was fading. Each candle he made took more from him. Each visitor he helped left him more depleted. The light he had been giving away for so long was running out, and even he, patient, generous, endlessly kind, couldn't give what he no longer had. Some mornings, he woke up barely there at all, a ghost of himself, a memory of light rather than light itself. But he kept making candles, kept tending his shop, kept being there for whoever needed him, even as his own reserves dwindled to nearly nothing. Sarah, Marcus, and David met regularly throughout the summer, forming a friendship based on shared understanding and mutual support. They burned their community candles together, their shared joy candles during celebrations, their chosen family candles when any of them needed reminding that they weren't alone. They talked about the cottage often, about Brennan and his impossible kindness, about how they wished they could do something for him in return for everything he'd done for them. But Willow Lane remained elusive. None of them could find it, no matter how hard they looked. The cottage appeared on its own schedule, according to its own rules, and those rules apparently didn't include visits from people who simply wanted to say thank you. On the last day of August, as summer began its slow fade into autumn, Brennan made his final candle. He didn't know it would be his last, didn't make any special ceremony of it, but his hand shook as he poured the wax, and his breath came short and labored. And when the candle was finally finished, cooling on his workbench, perfect and beautiful and full of captured light, Brennan sat down heavily and acknowledged what he'd been denying for months. He was finished, empty. He had given away every last bit of light he had, and there was nothing left to give. The candle he'd just made was unusual. Instead of being meant for a specific person or a specific purpose, it seemed to be meant for everyone and no one. A candle that smelled like every good thing that had ever existed: vanilla and wood smoke, rain and roses, bread and honey, ocean air and forest morning, all of it swirled together into something impossible and perfect. Brennan labeled it carefully for whoever needs it most. Then he climbed the stairs from his workshop one final time, placed the candle on a shelf near the door where it would be easy to find, and settled into his chair by the stove. He was so tired, more tired than he'd ever been. Tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion into something deeper, something that felt like completion. He had done his work, had made thousands upon thousands of candles over his long, long life, had provided comfort to countless people who needed it desperately, had captured beauty and hope and healing in wax and wick, had given it freely to anyone who found their way to his door. It was enough. He was enough. And if this was the end, if he had finally, completely given away everything he had to give, then at least he had spent his light doing something worthwhile. Brennan closed his eyes, a small smile on his weathered face, and let himself rest. The cottage remained on Willow Lane for 3 more days, its door unlocked, its candles burning gently on their shelves. A few people found it during those final days. They entered cautiously, calling out for the Candlemaker, receiving no response, but helping themselves to candles anyway, leaving money on the table or notes of gratitude, taking what they needed and moving back out into the world with their wrapped packages held close. On the 4th day, Sarah decided to try one more time to find Willow Lane. She didn't know why. just a feeling that she needed to see Brennan, needed to thank him one more time, needed to tell him about the life he'd helped her build. She walked the familiar route, and this time, miraculously, Willow Lane appeared exactly where she remembered it. But something was different. The cottage looked the same, but felt different. Quieter, more still. Sarah approached slowly, her heart in her throat, and pushed open the door. The candles were still burning, hundreds of them, filling the space with golden light and impossible scents. But the chair by the stove was empty. No, not empty. There was an impression in the cushions, as if someone had been sitting there moments ago. And on the armrest, a note written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. "Thank you for letting me help. The candles are yours now. Use them wisely. Share them freely. Remember that light is meant to be given away." Sarah picked up the note with shaking hands, reading it twice, 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. The candlemaker was gone. Not just outgone. She could feel the absence of him in the air, in the suddenly purposeless flickering of all these candles with no one to tend them. She called Marcus and David. They arrived within the hour, both having experienced the same inexplicable urge to try finding the cottage today. Together, the 3 friends stood in Brennan's shop, surrounded by hundreds of burning candles, and tried to process what had happened. He gave everything, Marcus said quietly, made candles until there was nothing left of him, gave away all his light to help people like us. "We should keep it going," Sarah said suddenly. "The cottage, the candles, we should learn how to make them and keep helping people the way he helped us." David nodded slowly. "We should, but I don't think we can. I don't think these are just regular candles that anyone could make. There was something else about them, something that came from him specifically." They stood in silence for a long moment, grieving a man they'd barely known, but who had changed their lives fundamentally. "Then we share them," Sarah decided. "All these candles he left behind. We share them with people who need them. We keep his work going for as long as the candles last. And we remember him. We remember what he taught us about kindness and comfort and being there for people when they need it most." It seemed right, felt right, like continuing Brennan's work in the only way they could. Over the following months, Sarah, Marcus, and David became the keepers of the cottage. They visited regularly, keeping the space clean and warm, making sure the candles were organized and tended. They learned which candles were meant for which kinds of pain, which scents helped with which struggles. And when someone in their lives was hurting, a coworker going through a breakup, a neighbor dealing with grief, a friend struggling with anxiety, they would take them to the cottage and help them choose candles, passing forward the gift Brennan had given them. The cottage didn't appear to strangers anymore. It stayed fixed on Willow Lane, no longer appearing and disappearing according to mysterious rules. It became a known place, a refuge that people could find deliberately rather than only when desperate. It wasn't quite the same as when Brennan had been there. The candles didn't seem to work as strongly. The scents faded faster. The magic was diluted without the candlemaker to fuel it. But it still helped. People still found comfort there. And slowly, bit by bit, the candles were given away to those who needed them most, until finally, 3 years after Brennan disappeared, the last candle burned down to nothing. It was the special one, the final candle Brennan had made, the one labeled for whoever needs it most. Sarah, Marcus, and David lit it together on a cold November evening. The three of them gathered around it in chairs pulled close together, breathing in the scent that was every good thing that had ever existed. As they watched the flame flicker and dance, they talked about Brennan, about what he taught them, about how one person giving freely of their light could change so many lives. "We should become candlemakers," Marcus said. "Learn the craft. Keep making candles, even if they're not magical ones. Even if they're just regular candles that smell nice." Because he was right. Everyone deserves small moments of comfort. Everyone deserves reminders that beauty exists. And so they did. They learned the craft of candle making. The three of them working together in the cottage that had once been Brennan's. They made simple candles, not magical ones, but good ones. Quality ones. Candles that smelled pleasant and burned clean and provided small moments of warmth in dark times. They sold them at craft fairs and farmers markets, donating the profits to mental health organizations and crisis hotlines. They gave them away to anyone who looked like they needed comfort. They taught classes on candle making, sharing the craft with others who wanted to create beauty in a world that often felt short on gentleness. It wasn't the same as what Brennan had done, but it was their way of honoring him, their way of keeping his light going even after he was gone. Years passed. The cottage on Willow Lane became a known landmark in the neighborhood. A small candle-making shop run by three friends who were uncommonly kind and whose candles, while not magical, somehow always smelled exactly right. People came to buy candles for gifts or special occasions. They came to take classes and learn the craft themselves. They came because the shop had a reputation for being a peaceful place, a refuge from the chaos of the world outside. Sarah, Marcus, and David never told anyone about the original Candlemaker, never explained that the cottage had once been more than just a shop, had once been a place of actual magic where desperate people found exactly what they needed most. That story was theirs to keep, their private knowledge, their reminder of where they'd come from and why they did what they did. But sometimes, very rarely, on nights when the cottage was closed and the three friends sat together making candles by lamplight, they would feel something, a warmth that had nothing to do with the melting wax, a presence that wasn't quite there but wasn't quite absent either. And they would smile, knowing that somehow, somewhere, Brennan was pleased with what they'd built from the ashes of his own giving. His light hadn't disappeared when he'd given it all away. It had scattered into 1,000 smaller lights, carried forward by everyone he'd helped, everyone he'd comforted, everyone who had found their way to his cottage in their darkest hour and left with hope wrapped in brown paper. That was the real magic, they realized. Not the candles themselves, but what the candles represented. The act of giving. The choice to be light in someone else's darkness. The decision to offer comfort freely, expecting nothing in return except the knowledge that you've made the world a little bit gentler. Brennan's cottage had been a beginning, not an ending. And the work he'd started, the work of providing refuge and comfort and small moments of peace, would continue long after the last magical candle had burned down to nothing. Because light, once shared, never truly disappears. It just finds new forms, new hands to carry it forward, new hearts to hold it close. And in that way, Brennan's light would burn forever. On a rainy autumn evening, 20 years after the cottage had been transformed from magical refuge to simple candle shop, an elderly woman walked down Willow Lane with purpose in her stride. Her name was Emma, And she had heard about this place from a friend who swore it had saved her life decades ago. The story had been vague. Something about a candlemaker who knew exactly what people needed. Candles that provided more than just pleasant scents. But Emma was desperate enough to believe in vague stories and impossible promises. Her husband of 42 years had Alzheimer's. Not the early stages anymore, where he forgot appointments and repeated questions. The deep stages, where he looked at her with confusion, where he called her by his mother's name, where the man she'd loved for 4 decades was disappearing piece by piece, moment by moment, behind eyes that no longer recognized her. The doctors said to put him in a facility. Her children, grown, busy with their own lives, agreed. It was too much for her, they said. She couldn't care for him alone. She needed help. But Emma couldn't imagine letting strangers tend to him in his final months or years. Couldn't bear the thought of him dying in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, with no one who remembered who he'd been before the disease stole him away. So she cared for him at home, fed him when he forgot to eat, bathed him when he couldn't remember how, read to him from her favorite books even though he no longer followed the stories, played their wedding song even though he didn't recognize the music anymore. And she was exhausted, bone deep, soul-crushing exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix because it went beyond the physical into something much deeper. She pushed open the door to the cottage and was immediately enveloped in warmth. The scent of candles filled the air, vanilla and lavender, pine and citrus, dozens of fragrances mingling together in a way that should have been overwhelming but was instead deeply comforting. 3 people looked up from their work, all of them white-haired now, weathered by time but still recognizably kind, still carrying something of that same gentle attention she'd been told the original Candlemaker possessed. "Come in," Sarah said, smiling. "You look like you could use some tea." And as Emma sat down in a worn armchair near a small stove where a kettle was beginning to sing, as she accepted a cup of tea and began to tell her story. The story she'd been holding inside for so long. The grief of watching someone die by inches. The guilt of wishing sometimes that the end would come so he could be at peace and she could rest. The 3 candlemakers listened with the same patient attention Brennan had given them so many years ago. They couldn't make magical candles, but they could listen. They could offer comfort. They could wrap up their best candles in brown paper and send this hurting woman back out into the world with something that might help, even if only a little. Sarah selected candles that smelled like endurance, strong black tea and morning sunlight, the scent of surviving one more day. Marcus chose candles that smelled like love, not romantic love, but the fierce, protective kind that keeps going even when everything is hard. David found candles that smelled like grace, the gentle understanding that doing your best is enough, even when your best feels inadequate. "You're doing something incredibly difficult," Sarah said as she wrapped the candles carefully. "You're giving him the gift of being cared for by someone who knows who he really is, who remembers his stories, who loves him not for who he is now, but for the whole lifetime of who he's been. That's not something a facility can provide, no matter how good they are. But it's okay to be tired," Marcus added gently. "It's okay to wish for it to end. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. It makes you someone who's been carrying an impossible weight for too long. And when it's over," David said quietly, "you'll know you did everything you could. You'll know he was loved until his last moment. That's worth more than you can imagine, both for him and for your future self who will look back on this time. Emma left the cottage with tears streaming down her face, clutching the candles like lifelines. She would burn them slowly, carefully, making them last through the difficult weeks and months ahead. She would let their scents remind her that she was strong enough to keep going, loving enough to see this through, brave enough to choose the hard path because it was the right one. After Emma left, Sarah, Marcus, and David sat together in the quiet cottage, watching the rain streak down the windows and listening to the gentle pop and crackle of candles burning on their shelves. "Do you think he knows?" Marcus asked quietly. "Brennan, do you think he knows what we're doing here? That we kept his work going?" "I think he must," Sarah said. "Wherever he is, whatever he became, I think he knows. I think he's proud." "I miss him sometimes," David admitted, "even though we only met him a handful of times. Even though we barely knew him. I miss knowing he existed. Miss knowing there was someone in the world who made magic out of kindness." They sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their own memories of that first visit, that first moment of finding refuge when everything else felt impossible. "We should tell the story," Sarah said suddenly. "Not publicly. I don't think the cottage could handle that kind of attention. But we should write it down. Make sure someone knows about him, about what he did, about what this place used to be." "Who would we tell?" Marcus asked. "Each other, maybe," David suggested. "And whoever comes after us. Because eventually we'll be too old to run this place. We'll need to pass it on to someone else who understands what it's really for." "Not just a candle shop," Sarah said. "No," Marcus agreed. "A refuge. A place where people can come when they're broken and find someone who will help them put the pieces back together. Or at least," David added with a small smile, "give them the tools to start doing it themselves." It felt right. Felt like honoring everything Brennan had taught them, everything he'd given them, everything he'd represented. Over the following years, they did write it down. The story of the Candlemaker who gave away all his light, the cottage that appeared when people needed it most, the candles that smelled like memories and hope and healing. They wrote it carefully, honestly, preserving not just the facts, but the feeling of what it had been like to stumble into that golden space in their darkest moments and find exactly what they needed. They kept the story in a leather-bound journal hidden in the cottage's back room, adding to it periodically. New visitors, new moments of connection, new small miracles of people finding comfort in unexpected places. And when they were too old to run the shop anymore, when their hands grew too shaky to pour wax and their backs too tired to stand for long hours, they passed the cottage on to a young couple who had found their own healing their years before, who understood instinctively and deeply what the place represented and what it needed to remain. The cottage continued. The candles kept burning. The work went on, because that's what light does. It doesn't disappear when the original source runs out. It just scatters in its smaller flames, carried forward by everyone it touched, everyone it warmed, everyone who learned that giving freely, without expectation of return, is the most powerful form of magic that exists. Somewhere, in a space that exists beyond geography and time, in the realm where given light goes when it leaves its original vessel, Brennan watches. He sees Sarah and Marcus and David running the cottage he built, helping people the way he helped them. He sees Emma burning her candles slowly, drawing strength from their scents as she cares for her husband through his final days. He sees Alex pursuing art despite everyone's doubts, painting with a freedom he never could have accessed before learning to listen to his true self. He sees Lisa gradually, courageously, expanding her world again with the help of therapy and those grounding candles she burns before each small act of bravery. He sees every person who ever found his cottage, who ever took his candles home, who ever used those small flames as reminders that beauty exists and comfort is possible, and they deserve gentleness even when everything is hard. And he understands, finally and completely, what he suspected all along. That light given away doesn't disappear. It transforms. It multiplies. It becomes something larger and more powerful than any single person could create alone. His cottage was never just his. It belonged to everyone who found it, everyone who was helped by it, everyone who learned from it and carried its lessons forward. And in that way, his light would burn forever, not as a single candle in a small cottage, but as 1,000 smaller lights scattered across the world, each one providing a moment of warmth to someone who desperately needed it. That was the real magic. Not the candles themselves, but what they taught. That one person choosing kindness again and again and again could change the world in small but profound ways. That comfort freely given creates ripples that spread farther than anyone can imagine. That the light you share never truly leaves you. It just finds new homes, new hands, new hearts to hold it close. The cottage on Willow Lane remained, tended by new caretakers who understood its purpose. The candles kept burning, made by new hands that had learned the craft with reverence and care. And people kept finding their way there when they needed comfort most. Not because the shop appeared magically anymore, but because word spread the way these things always do, through whispers and suggestions, and people saying, "There's this place that might help," without fully explaining what or where or why. The magic had changed form, become quieter, more subtle, but it hadn't disappeared. It had simply scattered into the world, waiting to be found by whoever needed it next. And that, Brennan understood from his place beyond place, was exactly how it was always meant to be. Sometimes one small light is enough. Sometimes one act of kindness creates ripples that never end. Sometimes giving away everything you have is the only way to ensure it lasts forever. The cottage on Willow Lane stood quiet in the autumn rain, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness, its door always open to anyone who needed refuge. Inside, candles burned steadily on their shelves. Simple candles now, made by human hands without any impossible magic, but still carrying comfort in their flames and hope in their fragrances. And somewhere, in the space between memory and magic, an old candlemaker smiled and rested, his work complete, his lights scattered across the world like stars in an endless sky. Warm, enduring, eternal, a small flame against the darkness. But sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes one small light is enough.